Hello, and welcome to the Mr. 50mm YouTube channel. Today, unfortunately, I've lost a couple millimeters. Today, we're having a look at the 7Artisans 10mm f2.8 ultra wide. It's an APS-C lens, and I've got the one in Fuji X mount flavor, obviously, since it's on my X-T3. Just a disclaimer here, this lens was sent to me from 7Artisans. I did not pay for it, and once the review is done, I do get to keep it. So keep that in mind. With that said, let's dive into this lens. What is the 7Artisans 10mm f2.8? Well, it's exactly that. It is a lens made by 7Artisans. It's an autofocus lens, by the way. It supports APS-C format sensors, and it gives you a rough field of view of about 105.3 degrees. The lens is made up of 11 elements in 10 groups. The aperture on the lens is a 7-bladed affair. And speaking of it, if you look at the camera or lens body, there is no aperture ring on this lens. But there is a USB-C port for firmware updates. So that's nice. The minimum focusing distance for this lens is 30 centimeters. The build material of this lens is metal, and the mount is metal as well. This results in the lens weighing at 232 grams. The lens comes in the following mounts: E-mount, Fujifilm X, and Nikon Z. Again, I have mine in the Fuji X mount. Finally, this lens comes in at $199 USD. For anyone that wants to know more about the lens, I'll put the link on the 7Artisans page in the description below. By the way, if there are any links that you see in the descriptions, they are not affiliate links. Just keep that in mind. All right, moving on. What's in the box? Well, the box has a couple things, but before we get started, I do like this. It is emblazoned with a big old 10 to remind you what focal length you bought. Neat stuff. But obviously, in the box, you get the lens. The lens comes with the lens hood. Nice touch. There are also front and rear caps. You have an included USB-C cable for firmware updates, and a paper little quick start manual thingy. Overall, a nice basic package, nothing crazy. Overall good stuff. Operation and feel. So this lens is reasonably small. At 232 grams, it's pretty light. The body is still made from metal, as I said, and it does help make it feel quite a bit more premium than other lenses, other budget wide lenses at this price point. Being a budget lens, though, the lens is a bit Spartan in terms of features. You do get an AF/MF switch. You have obviously a manual focus ring, and it's pretty well damped. The lens itself takes 62mm filters, so it's a nice common size. And overall, I find the lens balances fairly well on my X-T3, and I don't have any problems shooting with it. The lens does have a couple nice touches that are less common on these budgety lenses. For example, there is a bit of weather sealing gasket material right there. It's probably hard to see, but it is there. And on the marketing material, they do state that it is dust and splash resistant for outdoor confidence. That doesn't actually equate to any sort of rating or anything, but to be fair, a lot of these dust ratings and whatnot don't really equate to any particular standard anyways, other than, I think, OM system, which does adhere to an IP rating of some sort. At any rate, another nice thing, as I mentioned before, the USB-C port, which I know it is common on these Chinese lenses, but it's less common on other third-party lens manufacturers, and I do like it. Additionally, while doing the review for this lens, I actually had to do a firmware update. So I have now done it on a 7Artisans lens, and it was fairly straightforward and simple. That being said, the link to the actual update is kind of weird, because it's not on the 7Artisans storefront page that you might browse this lens on. It is on a different page, www.en.7artisans.com. I'll put a link to that in the description below, since for some reason, if you just look up 10mm 7Artisans, you get straight to the storefront page, and therefore it is not the firmware page, which I guess makes sense, but it does make finding the firmware a bit harder. And I did only really find out about the firmware update from a social media notification. So if you're not into the 7Artisans media, you might not find it. Anyways, I'll put the link in the description below, but it is straightforward. Basically, you download the firmware update for the lens you got, extract it, find the firmware for the mount for the lens you got, and then at this point, I assume you have plugged in your lens, but it'll populate a drive. You transfer that firmware onto the drive's root folder. It'll transfer, and then it'll automatically disconnect, and you'll wait, because the reconnection indicates that it is done updating. And then once it reconnects, the drive will appear again. There's a text file in the drive. You can click it and double check that your firmware is loaded. Easy peasy. There's a video on the page as well for how to do it, although I do find it a bit of a janky video. It generally works though. All right, now let's talk about the manual focus ring. As is the norm nowadays, it is fly-by-wire, so there's no direct coupling to the optical bits. Personally, not a fan, but it generally works, and on my X-T3, I can choose whether or not I want it to be a linear response or not. So, also good. One thing I noticed when shooting this lens is the minimum focus distance. It's 30 centimeters, which feels close, but I actually had trouble with this. I tend to get really close with my ultra wides, and there were a couple times where I was closer than that. I would prefer if this lens would drop down to 25 or 20 centimeters close focus distance. For me, 30 is just a little too far when I would really like to just fill in a little more of the frame. But that might just be a me thing. Honestly, otherwise, there isn't a huge amount to say on this section. As I said earlier, there's a lack of an aperture ring, and it's a bit annoying, especially on Fuji X mount, where I'm really used to a lot of my X mount lenses having an aperture ring. So I find myself twisting a ring that ain't there. However, at this price point, it's forgiven. Image quality and autofocus. Overall, I found image quality on this a bit of a mixed bag, which kind of shocked me. If you remember my review of the manual focus 6mm fisheye, I was pretty pleased with that. This is, as I said, a little more mixed. For $200, understandably, you aren't getting the moon. But let's see what you are getting. First, sharpness. In the center, it's not bad. It starts off a bit soft, but acceptable. And that's at F2.8. As you stop down, it basically improves pretty regularly, with it peaking out at around F8 or F11. And at that point, it becomes very, very good. The corners are a bit of a different story. They start out pretty rough at 2.8. There's a lot of smearing, and there's not a huge amount of detail. By F4, things start to look better, and things get good at F8, but they don't get close to the center. So keep that in mind if you are planning to use it and you want to have sharpness across the frame. You can get decent sharpness across the frame, but it's not turbo good sharpness. And again, keep in mind, I'm using it on my 26 megapixel X-T3. Let me know if you are using this and are using it on the monstrous 40 megapixel Fujifilm cameras. I want to know how this performs on that. At any rate, I do find that generally when you're shooting this, while things are good at 2.8, stopping down really does help. And F8, I think, is the gravy zone. Although, for me, when I was using it, I tended to kind of sit at around 5.6. So F8, I think, is a gravy zone if you want everything across the frame as good as it can get. If you just want the center, I'd be pretty happy at F4, and something in the middle is 5.6. But yeah, I tended to leave it at around 5.6, leaning towards getting more sharpness overall rather than just at the center. So this lens is wide. And that means that it is going to vignette a bit. But it's actually not too bad. Looking at the samples, it's not a huge amount and it's easily correctable. I kind of expected it to be a little worse. When it comes to distortion, the lens does show a bit of barrel distortion, but keep that in mind. I do think it is reasonably correctable at this point in time. I don't think there's a profile I had. At least there isn't one on Raw Therapy. There's probably one on Photoshop or whatever the other bigger softwares are. So yeah, it's handleable. With regards to chromatic aberration, I find it's overall pretty well handled by this lens. Wide open, yes, you're going to see some, but stopping down to 4 or 5.6 keeps this in check. The lens also does sun stars, and it does them reasonably well. I mean, it's part of the marketing material. You get 14 points on them stars. And I do think it's pretty good. I like it. One thing to point out is the lens is pretty susceptible to flare and ghosting when you give it strong light sources in or adjacent to the frame. If you aren't careful, much contrast will be robbed. Now, we'll say the hood provided does actually provide pretty good protection from said robbing flareage. But personally for me, I really hated I just don't carry hoods around that often. So if I really need to, I'll do one of these and look like a weirdo. Bokeh, blurrage. Being an ultra-wide lens, it's not going to be the strong suit of the lens. But if you're like me, and you like getting close, maybe too close, focus will allow you, the lens will allow you to get some background separation on your subject. I also find it looks reasonably decent. Obviously, it's not going to be like an f1.4 or a 35 f1.4, but you're going to get some. And I actually noticed that in some scenarios, when you have the corners smearing in a bit, or smearing, it kind of helps focus the image towards your subject along with the background separation. So overall, it combines to, for me, result in a reasonably pleasing bokeh. So yeah, doable if you wanted to do that. Don't expect it anything other than minimum focus though. It is after all very wide. Let's now have a chat about autofocus. This is admittedly a wide-angle lens. F2.8, by the way, if you didn't remember, and therefore autofocus, I find, tends to be very quick. There isn't a huge amount to rack, and the X-T3 had no problem, for the most part, locking on to things, doing face tracking. It was pretty reliable overall. The only thing, again, that I felt was a bit annoying was that 30 centimeter minimum focus distance. I would always kind of be too close, and there would be times where I'm just jabbing the half press, wondering why it won't lock, until I'll look away from my finder and realize I'm too close. I guess in this scenario, composing from the rear LCD might have actually helped me gauge the distance better, but I don't like it, so. Video mode. This lens is $200, so obviously it doesn't have any optical stabilization. So for this part, I'm mainly going to talk about focus breathing and focus noise. The lens does exhibit some focus breathing when you rack it back and forth. I'm no expert in it. After all, I'm no moving picture augraphizer. I primarily do stillsies and this stuff. But I don't think it looks too bad. Yes, there is some if you look for it. But I didn't find it to be overly distracting. But you can be the judge in the sample coming up. Next, we'll talk about the autofocus noise, as I just mentioned. I find that this lens is quite quiet. You can hear the lens shift elements around, but you do have to listen for it. And if you're not using the onboard mic, I don't think you'll ever hear it. But on the samples that you're going to see, I am using the onboard mic to emphasize the noise. So yeah, overall, I think for video use, pretty good. All right, we are just outside and we are going to quickly do a focus breathing test. Let's get started. And to me, it looks pretty minor, but it is there. All right, that's it. Recommendation and conclusion. Overall, I would recommend this lens. Its price point, after all, is around $200, $199.99. And despite there being lots of third-party competition, I think they all kind of have their strengths and weaknesses. And for the price for 7Artisans, it's hard to go wrong with this one. You can get a couple things that aren't available in these other third parties. But also, when you compare to companies like Tamron or Sigma, the closest lenses that they have tend to cost several times more than this lens. And are they several times better? I don't know. I don't have one, but looking at some of the samples, they're good. I don't know if they're multiple times as good. Fujifilm's own 8mm f3.5 would be the next closest thing to this lens. And yes, it is a bit wider, but a bit slower. And it's 3.5 times more dollars. And again, is it worth 3.5 times as many? To some, maybe. But I don't know. I don't have it. As a value lens, I think it does fairly well. You get reasonably good image quality, and if you stop it down, it becomes pretty good. Focus is indeed very snappy. It isn't very heavy, and the build quality is pretty nice, being one of the few to be made out of metal at this price range. But again, as I said before, I do wish it focused closer. Otherwise, thanks again to 7Artisans for sending this lens to me. This was a lot of fun to play with, and having autofocus this time made it a bit easier to use. But let me know, what do you think of the 10mm f2.8? Do you often shoot this wide? I'm still not that used to it. It's not nearly as mind-jarring as the 6mm fisheye, but still, for me, pretty dry. Anyways, let me know in the comments below, and as always, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Maybe a super thanks if you're into that. Till next time, bye.